The radio crackled with static before the voice came through, calm and final. "All units RTB. Mission's over. We're done here." Commander Hayes didn't sound defeated, just exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that came from watching good people die for bad intelligence. The forward operating base had been overrun 3 hours ago, survivors scattered across 12 miles of hostile terrain, and the quick reaction force had already burned through their window. The enemy knew exactly where to wait, exactly when to strike. Someone had sold them out, and now the cost was being counted in dog tags and blood-soaked sand. The AC-130 gunship had expended its ammunition. The Apache gunships were bingo fuel. Even the Reaper drones overhead had gone silent, their Hellfire racks empty, their cameras recording nothing but the slow approach of technical trucks and armed fighters closing in on the last American position. Captain Morrison, ground force commander, sat in a dust-filled crater with 19 men and women who had accepted their fate with the kind of quiet dignity that never made it into the movies. They weren't crying. They weren't praying. They were just checking magazines one last time, sharing water, and watching the sky turn amber with the setting sun. Then someone heard it, a sound that didn't belong, not the high whine of a fighter jet or the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors, something lower, deeper, a growl that seemed to shake the earth itself before it ever touched the air. Morrison lifted his head, squinting through the dust and smoke, and saw it coming in from the west. Low, impossibly low. An A-10 Thunderbolt II, painted in desert camouflage that had been scoured pale by sand and sun, its nose scarred with impact marks that spoke of missions flown long past their recommended lifespan. But that wasn't what made Morrison's breath catch. It was the landing gear, or rather the absence of it. The left main gear was completely gone, torn away by something catastrophic, leaving only twisted metal and exposed hydraulics. The right gear hung at an unnatural angle, half deployed and useless. The aircraft was flying on willpower and physics, its belly already scraped raw, its titanium bathtub glowing faintly in the dying light. "Who the hell is that?" Morrison whispered. The radio answered with a voice that was steady, almost conversational, touched with an accent that carried the red dirt of Oklahoma and the iron of something much older. "Ground element, this is Reaper 11. I've got eyes on your position and approximately 400 rounds of 30mm Freedom that disagree with your retirement plan." Morrison felt something he hadn't felt in hours. Hope. Dangerous, stupid hope. The A-10 banked hard, exposing its damaged underside to the enemy fighters closing from the north. No sane pilot would do that. No sane pilot would still be airborne with that kind of damage. But whoever was flying Reaper 11 wasn't interested in sanity. They were interested in mathematics, and the equation was simple. 19 lives on the ground versus one already dying aircraft in the sky. The numbers worked. They always had for Captain Nora Kine, call sign Reaper, veteran of 247 combat sorties, survivor of an ejection over Kandahar that left her with a rebuilt spine and a medical retirement she'd ignored. And the only pilot in theater who still flew an A-10 like it was a living thing instead of a machine. She didn't announce her return to active duty with paperwork. She announced it by stealing an aircraft that had been marked for decommissioning, forging a flight plan, and disappearing into Syrian airspace 3 days ago. Command had been looking for her ever since. Now they'd found her, or rather, she'd found them, and the timing was either providence or poetry. Kine toggled her weapons selector with a gloved hand that trembled slightly from adrenaline, not fear. Fear was for people who had something to lose. She'd lost it all already: her health, her career, her marriage, and very nearly her life. What remained was purpose, and purpose didn't require landing gear. "Reaper 11, be advised you are not cleared for engagement," Hayes cut in, his voice tight with regulations and desperation. "You are not, repeat, not cleared for this airspace." Kine's response was measured, almost gentle. "Commander, with respect, I stopped asking for permission about the same time I stopped having a future. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a gun run to make, and I'd rather not waste time explaining physics to people who have never felt an airplane shake itself apart around them. She nosed down, lining up on the lead technical truck. The GAU-8 Avenger rotated in its housing, 7 barrels of precision hatred waiting to sing their 30mm song. Kine breathed out slowly, feeling the aircraft respond to her touch like a tired warhorse that knew its rider. The landing gear situation meant she had 1 pass, maybe 2 if she was lucky. After that, physics and fuel would force her into a belly landing in hostile territory, assuming she didn't simply disintegrate on impact. But 2 passes were enough. 2 passes could save 19 lives. Morrison watched the A-10 drop below the ridgeline, disappearing from view for 3 heartbeats before erupting back into sight with the GAU-8 screaming. The sound was unmistakable, legendary, a deep resonating brrrrrt that turned metal into vapor and men into memory. The lead technical disintegrated in a cloud of shrapnel and fire, its occupants never understanding what had killed them. The second truck swerved wildly, trying to evade, but Kine had already calculated the adjustment. Her second burst walked across the desert floor like the fingers of God, each depleted uranium round carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through engine blocks and continue into the earth itself. Jesus Christ, someone whispered in Morrison's unit. Close air support, Morrison corrected, his voice thick with something between awe and disbelief. That's what this was supposed to look like. Kine pulled up hard, feeling the airframe groan in protest. The damaged gear assembly gave another shuddering lurch, and warning lights cascaded across her instrument panel like Christmas in hell. Hydraulic pressure was falling. The right engine was running hot. She had maybe 10 minutes of flight time remaining, and that was optimistic. But the enemy convoy was fracturing, technical trucks scattering in panic, fighters abandoning their assault to hunt for cover. It was enough. Just barely, but enough. Ground element, you've got a window, Kine transmitted, banking wide to line up another pass. I'd suggest using it before my airplane remembers it's not supposed to be flying. Morrison was already moving, hand signals sending his people toward the extraction point they'd abandoned hours ago. Hope was dangerous, but it was also fuel, and they burned it now with desperate efficiency. Behind them, Kine brought the A-10 around for her second pass, and the GAU-8 sang again. The story of how Captain Nora Kine became Reaper had been told in briefing rooms and bars across 3 continents, usually as a cautionary tale about ego and recklessness. She'd been 24, fresh out of flight training, assigned to a squadron that flew A-10s like they were delivering mail instead of violence. Her flight lead had been a man named Carrick, call sign Prophet, who believed in regulations the way priests believed in scripture. On their 7th mission together, they'd been tasked with supporting a reconnaissance element that had stumbled into an ambush. Prophet had followed procedure perfectly, maintaining altitude, coordinating with JTAC, waiting for authorization that came 3 minutes too late for 2 of the Marines on the ground. Kine had watched those men die through her targeting pod while she flew in careful circles at 8,000 feet. She'd watched their heat signatures fade from bright white to cooling gray. She'd listened to their final transmissions cut off mid-word. And when Prophet had said, "Nothing we could do, that's just how it goes sometimes," she'd made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She'd requested a call sign change, submitted it through proper channels with a single-sentence explanation. "Because I'm here to collect, not to witness." The name stuck. So did the reputation. Kine flew closer, lower, and harder than anyone else. She bent rules until they screamed and broke them when they didn't bend. She saved lives that command had written off and destroyed targets that weren't supposed to exist. And eventually, inevitably, she pushed too hard. The ejection over Kandahar happened because she'd stayed too low for too long, trying to protect a convoy that had already been evacuated. The SA-18 caught her low and slow, and the ejection sequence fired while she was inverted at 400 feet. The seat worked. The parachute worked. Her spine didn't. Doctors said she'd never fly again. She proved them wrong. Command said she'd never be cleared for combat. She proved them wrong too in the most illegal way possible. And now she was here, flying a dying airplane with no landing gear, no future, and nothing left to prove except that some people were worth dying for. Her third pass emptied her ammunition completely, the GAU-8 falling silent with a finality that felt like a door closing. The enemy convoy was scattered, burning, broken. Morrison's element was moving fast toward the extraction zone, covered by the confusion she'd created. The mission parameters had shifted from hopeless to possible, and possible was a miracle in this theater. Reaper 1-1, you are Winchester and damaged, Hayes transmitted, his voice careful now, almost reverent. Recommend immediate egress to nearest friendly airfield. Kine checked her fuel, checked her hydraulics, checked the gouges in her airframe that she could feel through the flight controls. Commander, nearest friendly field is 120 miles northeast, and I've got maybe 60 miles of flight time before this bird becomes lawn furniture. Mathematics says I'm not making it home. Silence on the radio, the kind of silence that carried weight. But, Kine continued, her voice steady, I can make it another 15 miles west, put myself between that convoy and your ground element until extraction is complete. Seems like a better use of my last few minutes than trying to dead-stick a belly landing in the dark. Reaper, that's not Hayes started. Sir, I've been dead since Kandahar, just been too stubborn to admit it, but those 19 people down there, they've got futures, families, reasons. Let me buy them the time to reach them. Morrison broke in, his voice rough. Reaper 1-1, this is ground element. Whatever you need, we owe you. You don't owe me anything, Captain, Kine said quietly. Just promise me you'll remember their names, the ones who didn't make it, the ones Prophet said we couldn't save. Promise me they're not just heat signatures fatting out. I promise. Kine throttled up, coaxing speed from engines that shouldn't still be running. The A-10 responded, faithful even in its dying moments, and she positioned herself between the survivors and the regrouping enemy forces. No ammunition, no gear, no future, but still here, still flying, still reaping. The evacuation took 11 minutes. Kine spent them flying a combat air patrol with an unarmed, crippled aircraft, making aggressive passes over enemy positions that scattered at her approach. They couldn't know her gun was empty. They couldn't know she was flying on fumes and faith. All they knew was the sound of that GAU-8 was seared into their memory, and the A-10 circling overhead was death given wings. It was enough. Barely, brutally enough. All personnel extracted, Morrison transmitted, his voice cracking slightly. Reaper, you're clear. Get yourself out of there. Kine looked at her fuel gauge, looked at the sun setting over the desert that had become her grave, looked at the controls of an airplane that had given her everything, and asked nothing in return except that she fly it honestly. Negative ground element. I'm going to put her down here. No point risking a crash near friendly territory. Reaper, you'll be in hostile. I know where I'll be, Captain, but this bird's earned a better ending than breaking apart over someone's farm. We're going down together, the way we were always meant to. She found a stretch of desert that looked flat enough, though the light was fading and her depth perception was starting to play tricks. The A-10 settled toward the earth, heavy and willing, and Kine felt the old familiar cocktail of fear and exhilaration that came with knowing this was it. The final landing, the last flight. The hydraulics failed completely at 200 feet, leaving her with nothing but muscle and trim to control the descent. She held the nose up with everything she had, felt the tail touch first, then the belly, and the world became a storm of sand and sparks and screaming metal. The A-10 skidded for 300 yards before physics finally won. The right wing dug in and the aircraft slewed sideways, rotated, and came to rest facing east as if watching for the sunrise it would never see. Kine's head cracked against the canopy frame despite the helmet, and darkness swam at the edges of her vision. She tasted copper and dust. felt warmth spreading from somewhere it shouldn't be spreading from, tried to move and discovered her left leg wasn't interested in cooperating. Reaper 1-1, do you copy? Hayes, urgent now. Kind found the transmit button through the fog. I'm down. Aircraft is totaled. She coughed, and it hurt more than it should have. I'm going to need a minute here, Commander. SAR is inbound, hang on. Tell them not to rush, Kind said, her voice fatting. Pretty sure the locals know exactly where I am, and I'm not going anywhere. She wasn't wrong. Through the cracked canopy, she could see headlights in the distance, converging on her position. The enemy fighters she'd scattered were regrouping, and they'd want answers, want revenge, want something to show for the disaster she'd made of their ambush. She tried to reach her sidearm and discovered her right arm was pinned beneath twisted metal. The left one still worked barely, and she managed to draw the M9 from its holster with fingers that felt distant and cold. 15 rounds, 15 chances to make this ending mean something. The first technical truck arrived 10 minutes later. Fighters dismounted carefully, approaching the wrecked A-10 with weapons raised and expressions that mixed rage with something like respect. They'd fought Americans before. They'd killed Americans before. But they'd never seen one fly a dead airplane into the ground just to buy 11 minutes for strangers. It was either madness or honor, and in this desert, the line between the two had always been thin. Kind raised the M9 with a hand that shook from blood loss and exhaustion. The fighters saw it, raised their own weapons. A Mexican standoff played out in the shadow of a dying aircraft while the sky turned purple and gold above them. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The moment stretched, taut as wire, waiting for someone to make the choice that would end it. Then a voice called out in Arabic, sharp and commanding. The fighters lowered their weapons slightly, confused. The voice came again, closer now, and Kind saw him walking through the scattered ranks of his own men, older than the others, wearing the kind of practical fatigues that spoke of experience rather than ideology. He approached the canopy slowly, hands visible, eyes taking in the damage to both aircraft and pilot. American pilot, he said in careful English, you are Reaper. Kind's vision was blurring, but she kept the M9 trained on him. That's what they call me. You saved those men, flew without landing gear, without ammunition at the end, without hope. Didn't need hope, just needed to buy time. The man was quiet for a moment, studying her with eyes that had seen too many wars and too many endings. I am Rashid. I commanded the convoy you destroyed. My men want your blood, want to drag you through the streets and post videos that will make your country weep. He paused. But I am old enough to remember when warriors had honor, when enemies could respect each other even as they killed each other. Is this the part where you let me go? Kind asked, her voice barely a whisper now. No, this is the part where I make sure your death is quick, clean, that your body is returned to your people so they can bury you with the dignity you earned. He glanced back at his men, then at the broken A-10. You flew well, American, better than well. You flew like someone who had already made peace with dying. Been practicing for a while, Kind managed. Rashid almost smiled, almost. Your rescue helicopters are coming, I can hear them. We will be gone before they arrive, but know this, we could have taken you alive. Could have made your last hours terrible beyond imagining. We chose not to, not because we fear your country, but because even in war some things are sacred. He straightened, touched his hand to his heart in a gesture of respect that transcended cultures. Die well, Reaper. You have earned that much. He turned and walked away, barking orders that sent his fighters back to their vehicles. Within minutes, they were gone, vanishing into the desert as quickly as they'd appeared. Kind slumped in her seat, the M9 falling from nerveless fingers, and listened to the growing thunder of helicopter rotors. The SAR team would find her, would cut her free, would race her to a field hospital where surgeons would fight for hours to save a life that had been borrowed time for years. She wouldn't remember the extraction, wouldn't remember the frantic voices or the medical jargon or the C-130 flight to Landstuhl. What she would remember later was the sound of her airplane dying around her and the weight of a man's respect given across the barrel of a gun. The rest was just details. Captain Nora Kynes survived, which surprised everyone including herself. The doctors rebuilt her again, installing more metal, more pins, more hardware than bone in some places. The military court-martialed her, which surprised no one, for stealing an aircraft, violating orders, and engaging in unauthorized combat operations. The trial lasted 3 days and would have lasted less if the prosecution hadn't kept getting interrupted by testimony from the 19 people she'd saved. Morrison took the stand and spoke for 40 minutes about what it meant to hear that GAU-8 when you'd accepted you were going to die. Hayes, who had tried to order her to stand down, admitted that she'd been right and he'd been wrong, and that sometimes the regulations were written by people who'd never had to choose between following orders and following conscience. The verdict was guilty on all counts. The sentence was a dishonorable discharge, stripped rank and forfeiture of all benefits. The judge, a 3-star general named Patterson who had flown F-16s in Desert Storm, delivered it with a face carved from stone. Then he'd paused, looked directly at Kynes, and added something that wasn't in the sentencing guidelines. "Captain Kynes, you broke every rule in the book, endangered lives, cost the taxpayers a multi-million-dollar aircraft, operated outside the chain of command with complete disregard for military order. For this, you will be punished as the law requires." Patterson had set down his gavel carefully. "But I hope you know that every pilot in this military, myself included, wishes they had the courage to break the rules the way you did, wishes they cared more about saving lives than saving their careers. You flew like a warrior from a different age, and while we can't condone it officially, we won't forget it either." The discharge was signed, the career was over, the legend was just beginning. Kynes moved to a small town in Oklahoma where nobody knew her face, and the sky was big enough to pretend she was still flying. She took a job at a hardware store, which amused her in a dark kind of way, from flying multi-million-dollar aircraft to explaining the difference between wood screws and drywall screws. But the work was honest and the people were kind, and for the first time since Kandahar, she wasn't defined by what she'd done but by what she did each day. It should have been enough. Would have been enough for most people. But 3 months after her discharge, a letter arrived. No return address, just a postmark from Virginia and a seal she recognized from intelligence briefings. Inside was a single page of text and a photograph. The text was brief, clinical, the kind of writing that tried to hide emotion behind facts. It detailed the extraction of Morrison's element, their return to duty, and the subsequent operations they'd conducted. 14 confirmed enemy combatants eliminated. 3 high-value intelligence targets captured. 2 cells disrupted, all directly traceable to the 11 minutes she'd bought them. The photograph showed 19 people in dress uniforms, standing at attention in front of a memorial wall. At the base of the wall was a plaque, and even in the photograph, she could read the inscription: "In memory of Captain Nora Kynes, call sign Reaper, who taught us that the mission isn't over until everyone comes home." She stared at that photograph for a long time, sitting in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and old wood, and finally let herself cry. Not for what she'd lost, but for what she'd gained. The knowledge that her last flight had mattered in ways that couldn't be measured in regulations or ranks. Morrison had kept his promise. He'd remembered the names, and he'd made sure she wouldn't be forgotten either, even in death, except she wasn't dead, which made the memorial both absurd and perfect. The calls started after that. Quiet inquiries from journalists who wanted to write her story, film producers who wanted to option her life, authors who wanted to capture her voice. She declined them all with the same polite firmness she'd used when declining medical retirement. This wasn't a story that needed to be sold or packaged or turned into entertainment. It was simply what had happened, and the people who needed to know about it already did. But the call that came 6 months later was different. It came through official channels, routed through intermediaries, and the voice on the other end belonged to a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen from DARPA's Tactical Aviation Division. She didn't waste time with pleasantries or pretend this was anything other than what it was, a job offer. "Ms. Kine," Chen had said, carefully avoiding the rank that had been stripped away, "we're developing next-generation close air support platforms, and we need someone who understands what it actually means to fly low and close. Someone who's felt an airplane shake itself apart while trying to save lives. The pilots we have are excellent, but they're trained to follow parameters. We need someone who knows when to ignore parameters." "I'm dishonorable discharged," Kine pointed out. "Can't even get a security clearance." "We're aware of your status. We're also aware that your discharge was political theater designed to appease people who have never seen combat. The people who actually matter, the ones who fly and fight, they know exactly what you are. And they want you involved in building the aircraft that will replace the A-10. Kine had looked out her kitchen window at the Oklahoma sky, vast and empty and calling. "The A-10 can't be replaced." "No," Chen agreed. "But it can be honored, by building something worthy of the pilots who flew it, by making sure the next generation has tools that let them be as brave as you were, by turning your last flight into a blueprint for how we think about close air support." The contract started 3 weeks later. Kine moved to Nevada, to a facility that officially didn't exist, and spent her days explaining to engineers and generals what it felt like to fly an aircraft with no landing gear. What calculations you made when the mission demanded more than the airplane could give. How you judged distance when your instruments were lying and your hydraulics were failing, and the only thing keeping you in the air was momentum and stubbornness. She became the ghost in the machine, the voice that challenged every design decision with the same question. But can you fly it when everything goes wrong? The engineers learned to hate that question and love her for asking it. The generals learned that stripping her rank hadn't stripped her authority, not where it mattered. And the pilots who came to the facility to test the new platforms learned that the dishonorably discharged woman in the back of the briefing room knew more about close air support than their entire chain of command combined. The A-10 replacement program was eventually shelved, killed by budget cuts and political realities, and the fact that nothing they designed could match the brutal efficiency of the original. But the work Kine did influence dozens of other platforms, from the way weapons systems were integrated to how pilots were trained to think about risk and sacrifice. Her legacy wasn't a single aircraft. It was a philosophy, that the mission mattered more than the rules, and that sometimes the bravest thing a pilot could do was refuse to abandon people just because the odds said they should. Years became a decade. The decade became routine. Kine found a rhythm in the work, in the teaching, in the slow accumulation of days that didn't involve explosions or blood or impossible choices. She dated occasionally, never seriously. Made friends with people who knew nothing about Reaper and liked Nora just fine. Built a life that was smaller than what she'd had but more honest, more sustainable, more hers. And then Morrison called. Not Captain Morrison anymore. Colonel Morrison, because the man she'd saved had kept saving others, had kept climbing the ranks through a combination of competence and the kind of moral authority that came from watching someone sacrifice everything for 19 strangers. His voice on the phone was older, weathered by deployments and decisions, but still carrying that rough edge she remembered from the crater. "Kine," he said, "I need a favor and you're going to hate it. Try me. We're dedicating a new close air support training facility. Andrews is insisting it needs a name, something that means something, something that reminds every pilot who walks through the doors what this job actually costs." He paused. "They want to call it the Reaper Center." Kine was silent for a long time. Outside her window, the Nevada desert stretched toward mountains that held secrets in their stone. Finally, "I'm not dead, Colonel, seems premature." "You died in that crater the same way I did," Morrison said quietly. "The same way we all did. Everything after was borrowed time, but you're the one who refused to accept it, who flew anyway, who made borrowed time matter. That's what we want them to remember, not the discharge, Not the controversy, just the flying. And if I say no, then we name it something else and move on. But the story doesn't change. What you did doesn't change. The 19 of us are still here because you decided regulations mattered less than lives. That's not going away, whether your name is on a building or not. The dedication ceremony happened on a Tuesday in spring, when the sky was clear and the wind was calm, and the world felt briefly like a place where good decisions could still happen. Kyne stood at the podium in civilian clothes, no rank insignia, no ribbons, no markers of the career that had been taken from her. Just a woman who had flown an airplane until it couldn't fly anymore, speaking to an auditorium full of pilots who would spend their careers trying to live up to an impossible standard. She talked about profit, about the Marines she'd watched die while flying in careful circles at 8,000 feet, about the moment she decided that witnessing wasn't enough, that collecting was the only job that mattered, about the A-10 that had carried her through 247 missions and refused to quit even when physics said it should, about Morrison and his 19 souls and the 11 minutes that had cost her everything and given her everything simultaneously. "They'll tell you I broke the rules," she said, her voice steady, carrying across the silent auditorium. "They're right. They'll tell you I cost the military millions of dollars and set a dangerous precedent. They're right about that too, but they'll also tell you that 19 people lived who were supposed to die, and that an A-10 with no landing gear and no ammunition still found a way to complete the mission. And if you're standing here today, learning how to provide close air support, then you need to understand something fundamental. The rules exist to protect the mission, not replace it. When those things come into conflict, you have a choice to make. I made mine. You'll have to make yours." She stepped away from the podium to silence, then to applause that started slowly and built until the auditorium was shaking with it. Morrison was crying openly. Hayes, now a general, was standing at attention with a salute that hadn't been authorized but wouldn't be stopped. And in the back row, visible only to Kyne who knew to look for them, were 3 people in civilian clothes who had flown with her, fought with her, and refused to forget her even when the military tried to erase her from the record. The Reaper Center opened the next day. Kyne didn't attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony, didn't give interviews, didn't participate in the mythology that was already forming around her name. She drove back to Oklahoma, to her hardware store and her quiet life, and tried to pretend that having a building named after her didn't mean she'd been turned into a symbol. Symbols were for dead people or saints, and she was neither. Just a pilot who'd made a choice and lived with the consequences. But the students at the Reaper Center didn't see her as a symbol. They saw her as a compass, pointing toward a North Star that had nothing to do with regulations and everything to do with purpose. Every pilot who graduated from that facility understood that close air support wasn't about precision or technology or overwhelming firepower. It was about the willingness to put yourself between harm and the helpless, to fly until your airplane quit, and to measure success in lives saved rather than targets destroyed. The A-10 was finally retired from service 14 years after Kyne's last flight. The ceremony was elaborate, ceremonial, full of speeches about legacy and capability, and the evolution of modern warfare. None of it mentioned that the aircraft being retired had been the same one Kyne had belly-landed in the Syrian desert, salvaged by a recovery team who'd spent 3 weeks cutting it into pieces small enough to transport. It had never flown again, but it had served one final purpose. As a teaching tool, displayed at the Reaper Center, its scarred belly and missing landing gear telling a story no textbook could capture. Kyne attended that ceremony, standing in the back where she hoped no one would notice her. But Morrison noticed. He always noticed. He found her afterward looking older now, grayer, carrying the weight of another decade of decisions. "She was a good airplane," he said simply. "Best I ever flew," Kyne agreed. "You ever miss it, the flying?" She considered the question honestly, looking at the dissected A-10 on its display stand, remembering what it felt like to coax speed from dying engines and hope from impossible mathematics. Every single day, she admitted. But I don't miss what it cost. Don't miss choosing between the mission and survival. Don't miss the weight. The weight of what? Of knowing that every life I saved was paid for with a piece of myself. That kind of math doesn't balance. It just accumulates. Morrison nodded slowly. For what it's worth, we're still here, still flying, still trying to be worthy of what you did. That has to count for something. It does, Kyne said. It counts for everything, just don't ask me to do it again. She left before the ceremony ended, driving back through the twilight with the radio off and her thoughts her own. The Reaper Center would continue training pilots. The A-10s that remained in service would continue flying until they too were relegated to museums and memories. And somewhere in the Syrian desert, the sand was already reclaiming the scars her belly landing had carved into the earth, erasing the evidence that she'd ever been there at all. But the 19 people she'd saved would remember. Their children would remember. And every pilot who walked through the doors of the Reaper Center would carry a piece of her forward, not as a ghost or a legend, but as proof that some choices were worth making even when the cost was everything. The sky would always be there, vast and indifferent and calling. And somewhere in Oklahoma, a woman who'd once been called Reaper would look up at it and remember what it felt like to fly, to fight, and to refuse to quit even when quitting was the only rational choice. That was the legacy, not the discharge or the controversy or the ceremony. Just the simple, brutal truth that when the moment came, when the radio crackled with, "We're done here," and the mission was supposed to be over, she decided it wasn't. And 19 people lived because of it. That was enough. It had to be enough. It was everything.